Good evening and welcome to the Canadian Orthodox Monastery. And we're filming in the chapel of the monastery today. Actually, this broadcast is really under the auspices of the Canadian Orthodox Centre for Biblical and Patristic Studies. And we're going to be discussing a problem that's facing so much of the world, not only in our day, but throughout history. And a problem that we really feel that as Christian people, we need to respond to in a much more positive and meaningful way. This is a question of incendiary language that is used in religion and politics, and worst of all, blended into a kind of religio-political ideology. And this kind of language often drives violence in the world, and has been known not only to drive massive violence and terrorism, but even individual acts of homicide or assassination, and to build up a spirit of hate and an atmosphere of fear. And those of us who are old enough to actually remember the time of the Second World War remember that this is precisely how demagogues and dictators get their power in the first place, through hatred and fear. And the fear always comes first, and the hatred is developed out of the fear. And it's done by rhetoric. It's done by the way people address issues and problems, and by the way they present this, particularly to mass rallies and now in our day in the mass media. And we want to really address this from perhaps the three perspectives that we can give to it. My colleague Ron Dart, who's an educator in the Anglican Church and a professor at the University of the Fraser Valley, and our colleague David Goa, whom is also teaches comparative religion. And he's also the director of the Chester Ronning Center for the Study of Civil Society and Religion, and consequently has a special interest in the interaction and sometimes the collision between civil society and religion. And we were going to start our discussion in ancient times and move forward to modern times to show how throughout history incendiary language, and very often the blend of religion and politics, has been deadly and has caused some of the great catastrophes in human history. And we want to try to shed a little light on how we should actually be responding to the incendiary language and to the problems that are generated when politics and religion get together and form an ideology which can be explosive, which can cause wars, and which can cause untold human misery. So, Ron, do you want to begin by give us a little history of the situation with Hypatia in Alexandria? Hypatia was a great philosopher and a scientist, a mathematician, and one of the great minds of the late antiquity in the city of Alexandria. And she was at a school of Neoplatonism, and was teaching not only Neoplatonism, but also was teaching mathematics and looking very carefully at astronomy and other sciences. And as one of the great minds of the era, she was very creative and often at odds with dogmatized ignorance or with dogmatized ideas that gradually science was disproving. And so you want to fill us in on the history of that a little bit?
Well, I think perhaps one of the points where we can start from is one of the films that's doing the rounds these days is Agora, or the Agora, and the movie is set in Alexandria, where Hypatia was a great teacher of Alexandria. And many of the up-and-coming students there studied under Hypatia. And there were a couple of clashes in Alexandria. One was, should Christians study with non-Christians? what could you learn from the Platonic Aristotelian heritage that really you could learn from the Bible and the Christian tradition? Why even study with someone outside your tradition? Wasn't this a way of thinning out? Wasn't this a way of betraying the tradition when you had the pure tradition in the Bible and that's all you had to focus on? So Hypatia was one of the leading philosophers in Alexandria at the time. And there were a variety of people studying under her. Some went on to become bishops, both in Alexandria and elsewhere. But underlying all this was first of all was the ideological religious question. What is the relationship between Christianity and other religions?
Particularly classical Greek.
Well, this was, and then you had some of the mythological traditions which were very much at work in Alexandria at the time also. And as you mentioned, this soon got folded into the politics of the time also, where you have religion gets merged with politics, and both are enfolded in an ideological understanding of the world, that this is the way you interpret the world. If you disagree with this, that means you're wrong, and then the language becomes exaggerated, and then that exaggerated language motivates people towards action and action violence. And the film itself explores bit by bit, piece by piece, slowly, how this worldview converts into language, the language converts into action, and the action leads to the death of Hypatia herself. And it's a fascinating movie that has a perennial relevance in that it looks at the underlying structure of worldviews. If a person sees life black and white, what's that going to translate into how you look at another religious tradition, another political tradition, and then what you do with people you disagree with. If you think you're absolutely right and the other is absolutely wrong. And in Hypatia's case, her final tragic death, gruesome death indeed. And then, of course, that way of looking at life we can fast forward into some of the larger ideological issues today, which are very much with us. So that underlying structure of the human mind, often how it will look at life in either or categories, rather than a more interactive both and, has quite an impact on people's lives, both in religion and politics. And maybe, David, you could comment on, or Archbishop Lazar, on how we can see this very way of seeing life and then treating others in our contemporary time.
Just for clarification, you talked about the either or, the black and white, that dichotomous absolutism that can seize people. Do you have a sense, Ron, that there is another way of holding to a strong faith without demonizing? I mean, part of my sense is that part of what's happened in the rhetoric, the dialectical rhetoric of our day, whether it's political left and right, whether it's religion and secular or what have you, is that we seem to have become convinced in public discourse that the only option is either having a soft faith, which has no implications, both and, your way, my way, all ways are okay, that kind of approach, or an absolutistic approach. Do you have a sense that one can have a very serious faith commitment and a very strongly understood sense of its implications, which does not lead to demonization, which actually is capable of holding with some gentleness and grace those that genuinely disagree with you?
You know, often I've been asked to mediate between people and publicly in what are called debates. And I always am a bit hesitant of debates. I prefer dialogue. And I usually ask both members on both sides one question. I say, I'd like you to tell me what you think is the good in the other person's position,
right,
and what do you think is the limitation of your own particular perspective.